this time in history, you had the Revolutionary War, the French Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution all happening at the same time. And so art during this period was heavily influenced by the politics that were and the change of government that was happening in our society. It started in Rome and spread throughout Europe. During this time was the Age of Reason and Enlightenment. People were focusing on science, history, mathematics, and anatomical correctness. A lot of artists were inspired when they toured they went on the Grand Tour, where they got to see Greek and Roman architecture and art. Pompeii had just been discovered, and people were traveling to see the sights. This movement is going away from Rococo, which was purely decorative, and they're using art to talk about politics. So they'd use classical Roman themes and stories to talk about what was happening in their political situation. The core belief of neoclassicism was that art should show ideals, virtues, and morals to create a better society. Art was used to change the way people think and to shape social issues. The neoclassicist movement adopted French Royal Academy hierarchy of painting, which goes from Bible to classical mythology to history, and then the lesser arts is portraiture, genre painting, landscapes, and still lifes. This hierarchy was used for prize selection and financial value. So Bible paintings would have been more valuable than a still life. The movement was shaped by John Locke and Descartes' philosophy, which was saying no to monarchy and religious dogma, and yes to individual liberty, religious tolerance, and constitutional government. Visual characteristics of the neoclassical art is serious, heroic, beautiful, clear, with sober colors, a shallow space, strong horizontal and vertical lines, and a smooth painting. The neoclassical movement was heavily inspired by Nicolas Poussin, who believed that strong drawing was rational and therefore morally better. So the drawing was more important than the painting. I didn't include any historical context for Romanticism because it directly overlaps the neoclassical art movement. This movement was a reaction against the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason. It went away from logic and reason towards emotion and imagination. This movement focuses on the power of nature over man and on folklore, spiritual topics. This movement was in France and Britain. The visual characteristics of this movement are expressive brushstrokes, imagination, emotion, power and unpredictability of nature, individualism, folklore, tradition, landscapes, and spiritual topics. A lot of this art varies looking through these paintings, but you'll notice that a lot of them harken back to a myth, like the Colossus, or such as this painting, which is very famous. It's romantic, it has imagination, it evokes emotion and feeling, and it's very expressive, compared to the neoclassical movement, which was very political, and it had less emotion, and it was more heroic. It had to do with government. This has to do with the human individual and what they're thinking and feeling and how they're interacting with nature. This painting is also very famous and political, but it is the spirit of the revolution, not and it's about the people. This is another myth of Medusa, and it's not realistic, but it's romantic and expressive. In conclusion, neoclassicism, which is at the same time, was focused on shaping political and social issues, whereas Romanticism was focused on human freedom, emotion, and power of nature. The Pre-Raphaelite movement is a short-lived movement from Great Britain, but the paintings from this time are very famous and influenced a lot of art later on. The Oregon Trail was happening, and also the Irish famine and the Civil War began in the 1860s. This movement was in direct opposition to the British Royal Academy. The Academy had a lot of power, but they were teaching a very narrow view of beauty, and that was based on convention and rote learning, which means that they were just teaching their students to memorize methods rather than have the experience of a real artist. The Pre-Raphaelites, therefore, were in opposition to that, and their name is talking about the times before Raphael, who was in the Renaissance. They valued experience, and a lot of their paintings are naturalism, which says detailed study of nature. They have a realistic form, unlike the Renaissance, which is idealistic in human form. And they have a lot of revived medieval styles. Their paintings are typically literature or biblically based, such as this painting of Ophelia or the previous painting of Jesus. So in conclusion, they painted natural, realistic subjects from literature and were in opposition to authority. Realism has the same historical context as the Pre-Raphaelites, so I did not include those pictures again. The realist movement was the first modern art movement, which means that it was a movement rejecting traditional forms of art. It was anti-institution and nonconformist. You could say that the Pre-Raphaelites were also nonconformist, but this is realism is a larger, more established movement, and it is known as the first modern art movement. Before realism, art was typically paid for, supported by institutions or individuals, institutions, churches, governments, academies, etc. During this period, artists started to self-publish and to show their art independently. French realism was post-revolution, post the French Revolution. They wanted a more democratic government, and therefore their art reflected the people, commoners. Realism began to give lower class and working class the same weight as the higher class. Visual characteristics of realism are dark, earthy palettes, so colors. They include gritty, real-life details. They use thicker brush strokes, and the biggest characteristic is that they're commonly scenes of peasant, working-class life, like cafes, streets, places of work, studios, fields. This was really the first time that artists had focused their attention and their power on representing the commoners, and this was the governments were being changed and democracy was being pushed for, and so the art was very important to finally give the working class representation, and it's a very distinct movement for that reason. For the first time, it wasn't just kings and politicians getting painted, it was farmers. Art Nouveau happened right before World War I. Also during that time, the Statue of Liberty, the Eiffel Tower, and the Brooklyn Bridge were being built. This movement happened in Western Europe and the US, but it was particularly French. During that time, there was two distinct categories, which were higher fine art and the so-called lesser arts. The movements, Art Nouveau, the arts and crafts movement, and the Art Deco movement, all endeavored to integrate those two categories. People who were in the lesser arts wanted to be in the higher, considered finer, and worth more for all the design that they were doing. Art Nouveau also wanted to bring art and design into our everyday objects. William Morris was a wallpaper and fabric designer. He did a lot of different design work, but he was a champion of this movement because he wanted the things that we use every day to be beautiful and to be art, and not just something that really, the most wealthy people could have. It was more of a style, less of a philosophy. There wasn't like a political push for Art Nouveau. but it was definitely reactionary against the neoclassical movement, which was more utilitarian. This was a very decorative movement, which wanted to lift ordinary people and probably more of the middle class to have art in their homes. A lot of visual characteristics were natural motifs, like in this lamp you can see it has a lot of flowers. They were decorative. There was fantasy. They have a lot of visual characteristics from Japanese art and Celtic art. The perspective was usually flat, and it was typically less realistic and more design, more fantasy and natural. This is William Morris. You can buy wallpaper and fabric and all sorts of things with his just these beautiful floral designs on them. Art Nouveau really set itself apart as a new type of art movement that started to bring the arts and crafts and design elements of art together into fine art, that they no longer had to be separate. You had posters, lamps, and desks, and a whole realm of new and exciting possibilities. Right after Art Nouveau, you have Art Deco. It was post-World War I, and the Roaring Twenties really set it off. It's probably the most well-known era for Art Deco, even though it continued on until right before World War II. This was also a decorative movement. It kind of molded several movements together. You have elements of Cubism, Constructivism, Futurism, Fauvism, and Egyptian art all meshed into this decorative style. When mass production started in the US, they kind of just simplified the style and used it for everything from clocks to cars. The movement had a fundamental belief in progress, human improvement, and futurism, which celebrates change. Everything kind of feels fast and powerful, and nothing can go wrong, and America's the best. And the style symbolized wealth, status, opulence, sophistication, and power. That's why by the time you hit, it was dying out in the Great Depression, but it also just died when it got to World War II, because it didn't really seem reasonable to be in this kind of celebrating power stage of our society. It was just too gaudy and too opulent. Visual characteristics are everything's very symmetrical, geometric, simple, with bright colors. Like other art and craft movements and decorative movements, it covered everything from our clocks to our buildings, and a lot of buildings were they're very recognizable in the Art Deco style, such as the Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, and Rockefeller Center. It's very easy to get Art Nouveau and Art Deco mixed up because they sound alike and they're pretty close together. An easy way to remember how they're different is Art Nouveau had a lot of natural lines, and it was very curvy and natural and fantasy, and had a lot of women. And Art Deco is very The Great Gatsby and lines and symmetry. It has bright colors and women also, but it's just kind of not as natural. It is more reminiscent of Cubism. So if you can remember, the Eiffel Tower was Art Nouveau, and it's very rounded and fluid, and the Empire State Building is Art Deco, and it has very hard lines and a lot of geometric shapes.